if you want to see me wince a little bit, just say Scrum methodology. Okay, I'm going to kind of twitch a little bit because Scrum is not a methodology. Okay, Scrum is a lightweight framework. Now, how many of us has this been our life's aspiration? Someday I wish I could maybe be on the assembly line. So at the beginning, we have customers and other kinds of stakeholders, and they have lots of things that they're wanting out of our product or whatever it is we're creating, right? And somebody has to take all those ideas and sort them out and decide what to do with them. And in Scrum, that somebody is very clearly the product owner. So product owners kind of filter these items. So there's a filtering process. And it turns out one of the main jobs of a product owner is to throw many of the ideas into the trash can or the waste bin. It's super important that a product owner says,
for the last time, no,
or
no,
or
no.
Okay. So you probably want to buy this button for your product owner, the no button. It's on Amazon, $9.99 with free Prime shipping, because product owners have to say no. They protect us from low priority work. And so they only allow high priority things to make it onto this thing called the product backlog. Product backlog, think of it as a list of kind of requirements. That's not exactly requirements, but let's call it requirements for right now, in priority order. But it's always changing, always shifting, thus the recycle symbol. Think of it as at least multiple sprints worth of work that are now stacked up, waiting for our team to pull them into sprints to accomplish them. Call that the product backlog. New thing in the Scrum Guide in November of last year, there's now a product goal that is part of the product backlog. So we have some overall goal. What are we shooting for the next few sprints? What's the overall thing we're trying to create? Like maybe first app version available to our friendly beta customers. And that might be a goal that we're working for the next several sprints. It is now part of the product backlog, a thing called the product goal. So it's a list of items and a goal. And it's maintained by the product owner. And so now we have the rest of the Scrum team here that was going to come into the picture. And the rest of the Scrum team is the Scrum Master and the developers. So all of three of these roles together are what we call the Scrum team. And now when we start doing sprints, the first meeting in the sprint is a thing called sprint planning. All three of us all the roles are here. And there's a new part that was just added to this meeting also in the new version of the Scrum Guide. It used to have a what and a how section. Now they've added a why. So there's a why section. In the why, we have to agree on what's the whole point of this sprint and what is the goal we're trying to accomplish. So we've had this thing called a sprint goal for a while, but now it has its own little section to talk about it up front. Product owner proposes a goal. Team has to agree to a goal or come up with a goal. So it's actually a whole team view. Product owners are, in charge, but also they have to kind of talk the team, into things too. So this is the whole team that owns the idea of the goal. And then in the second topic, the what, the team decides how many items can they pull in off the top of this product backlog to get done in the sprint. And they're going to pull some number of these items into the sprint. Typically like 3 to 9 or something, depending on the team. They pull in some number of items, and this is what they think they can get done in the sprint. So that is the what. We also ask a lot of questions of the product owner here to make sure we're clear on the work. And then finally, the third one is the how. And in the how, we talk about a little bit of a plan. How are we going to make this happen? Sometimes that includes breaking those stories or those backlog items into things called tasks. This is just sort of a traditional thing in Scrum. So all three of these things, this is a pretty big meeting, it turns out, that are very commonly can take up to 3 hours for a lot of teams, 1 to 3 hours. And so out of this whole thing, we now have come up with our plan for the sprint, and we call that plan the sprint backlog. Now, interestingly, the sprint backlog has multiple things in it. It has the list of those items we pulled off the product backlog. It has the goal. and it has the plan, which might be the tasks. So notice the really fascinating synergy they've created now. There is a why, what, and a how section of the meeting. There is a why, what, and how section of the sprint backlog. Goal is why, backlog items is what, tasks or plan is how. So that's what happens in this meeting that we will describe in more detail, of course. And so this is where the team comes up with their own plan for how to accomplish the work. And all of this is now happening inside something called a sprint. Sprint is a time box in which we get our work done. Very commonly, these days, most software teams tend to do 2 weeks. So we'll just go with 2 weeks here as an example. So it's a 2-week time period. First meeting or event is the thing called sprint planning. And now we've come up with a plan in the morning of the first day, probably. And now the team is off working on their stuff. And this is all happening inside this thing called the sprint. Every day, we're supposed to do this thing called the daily scrum, often called the stand-up, because traditionally it was done standing up when we're physically co-located. This is a hugely misunderstood meeting in most companies. We're going to call it for now the how will we make it a great day meeting. Okay. So this is the developers meeting, not the Scrum Masters. And it is specifically to make sure they know how they're going to make a lot of progress today. Little short touch point. What's our plan to make progress today? That's the daily scrum. It's never more than 15 minutes long, and we mean that. So we'll talk about some techniques to keep it down to that. So that happens pretty much every day, and we're staying really, really focused on our work. We're trying to get all that stuff done that we just pulled in. And then here comes the weird one. Backlog refinement activity. Okay, first the word activity. This is the one activity of Scrum. Sprint planning is a meeting or event. Daily Scrum, meeting or event. This is an activity. So what does that mean? Well, while the team is in here working on their sprint backlog and trying to get stuff done, where do you think the product owner is spending most of their time? What are they doing?
Running the backlog.
Yeah, updating that backlog, talking to stakeholders, like there's another loop going on out here, chatting with customers, with stakeholders, updating the backlog. All of this is backlog refinement. Okay, getting items changed, updated, smaller, near the top, things like this. This is all backlog refinement. But so is interrupting the team from the current sprint to talk about the items near the top of the product backlog that are going to get pulled into the next sprint. Now, we just talked about focus being one of our values, didn't we? And now I just said we're letting the product owner interrupt the team to talk about the future. Why would we do that? Let me ask something more specific. What do the developers know about the new items and stuff that are coming up that the product owner does not know?
Technical complexities, or if
Yeah.
there is any background work required.
How much work it is, how big is the
How long
item,
it'll take.
right? Size, we sometimes call that, yeah, or estimate. Yeah, so it turns out size matters to product owners, okay? Yeah, so yeah. So yeah, if we think about that, if the product owner needs that information to do their final priority calls, right? Because they'll sometimes got to do cost benefit things. And if the team comes back and tells us this one story is like 5 times bigger than this story, then they're going to make some interesting trade-offs, and it may change the order of the backlog. So we're giving them essential information to do their job, which is prioritizing. We'll talk a lot more about that, but this is a really unusual one here. It's kind of like 2 things. It's a constant background process of updating the backlog by the product owner, and it's a meeting interrupting the team sometimes to get some information from them, like sizes or estimates. So we'll keep talking about this one. We'll probably talk about it about, I'm going to say a dozen times over the next 2 days. Okay. So that's backlog refinement. with that one exception, we're staying really focused on our backlog, on our, the goal, on all of our work. And specifically, we're trying to create the thing called the product increment, what they called in the video, the potentially shippable product. That was the older term. I like that term a lot. Now they call it product increment. So what the heck does that mean? Well, let's think about that. Increment. So it's like it's incremental functionality or something. It's like we had a product and now we have a new, cooler version of our product. That's the product increment. So it's something we just created that has more value, more something in it. And so we create this thing called the increment. And so now we have a new version of our product. It's got this fun new thing that the sprint goal was all about, like a new form is working maybe, or something like that. And now we're going to stop. We're at the last day of the sprint here. We have this thing done, and we go into these two final events or meetings. And the first one is the sprint review, what some of you call the demo. And in the sprint review, we're going to show proudly to our stakeholders and ideally live customers, here's that cool new thing I just made for you. And now we show it to them. What do you think's the output of that meeting? We talk a little bit about the sprint. We show them the cool new thing.
Revision items.
Sorry, what is it, Fasan?
Revision items, like
Revision?
what needs to be revised.
Yeah, what needs to be revised possibly, or new ideas it made us think of, or, oh my gosh, that's so cool, but what about this, right? This is the kind of stuff that this meeting generates. And to be really, really clear, that's the whole point of creating the product increment, is to get that feedback. So the actual output is new product backlog items.
Right.
Yeah. And to be clear, at first you're going to be tempted to think about that as a bad thing, but no, that's the whole point, right? We did it specifically to get them to have those ideas. And now the product owner gets to struggle with where to fit that in here with everything else that we already had on our list. So that is the desirable output, new backlog items. So that was the big meeting with the customers and everybody, we hope. And then it's followed by the last event in Scrum and the only truly private one. This is a Scrum team only meeting. Nobody else is allowed to come unless we invite them. And this is called the retrospective. Now we're not talking about the product really, we're talking about the process. So this is where we agree on changes, things like that, okay? What do you think becomes the output of this meeting?
Becoming more efficient.
Yeah, hopefully becoming a better, more productive team, learning some new ways to work together. What if, though, somebody had this brilliant idea, guys, is it finally time we should go look into like a unit test automation tool? I think we should do that. What does that become? A new product backlog item. Okay. Because really, you're tempted to think of a product backlog as just like features or something. No. Product backlog is anything that takes the team's time. So that can be process improvements. It can be defects we have to work. It can be investigations. It can be a lot of stuff. So both of these create new product backlog items.
Hey, Steve, does in like the Scrum framework, do they actually call that the spikes when you actually do like the additional research based on that?
That is a good term that we often use, Jessica, a spike. So a spike is like an investigation item. So maybe the team sees an upcoming item and they look at it and they go, whoa, we've never done that kind of thing before. And now they break off an investigation item, which we call a spike, and that can be on the backlog too. Okay. Anything that takes the team's time is a backlog item, not bathroom breaks, but other than that, pretty much anything that takes the team's time is a backlog item. For the sprint review, we're all part of it here, Marcus. This is all of us here together in the sprint review, whereas the retrospective is only the Scrum team. So nobody else is allowed to be there. That's just the team themselves thinking through how did the sprint go and what could we improve. And there's a really important idea here that most people miss about Scrum. Improvement every sprint is not an option in Scrum. It is mandatory.